welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Poloz in Ottawa on this Tuesday. Tonight, Carney's caucus heads west.
I'm not sure you can separate the state of the economy and Trump and tariffs, frankly.
Liberals gather in Edmonton with a tall order ahead. Meet the Prime Minister's austerity promise as Canada's economy teeters on the edge of a trade war recession. We're going to take you to that retreat with the caucus chair, then bring in former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz on the economic reality the Feds and Canadians are up against. Then, breaking news out of the United States at this hour. The Supreme Court has just decided to hear arguments in the case against Donald Trump's tariffs this November. Oregon's Attorney General is leading that legal battle, and he will be with us live coming up. Plus, Poilievre's play.
Nothing is getting built, nothing is getting done, and our economy is collapsing.
The Tory leader makes a string of policy pitches, most aimed at young Canadians ahead of his return to Parliament. What's the strategy and will it work? Our front bench will talk about that a little bit later on in the show. First, though, fresh off last week's cabinet retreat, Prime Minister Mark Carney is now gathering all his MPs, not just ministers, in Edmonton for a strategy session ahead of next week's return to Parliament. They're facing fresh economic headwinds in both Donald Trump's tariffs as well as slowing GDP and a rising unemployment rate. We're going to check in Edmonton with caucus chair James Maloney in a few moments. But first, let's get a clear picture of those economic headwinds. Stephen Poloz was the governor of the Bank of Canada and is now a special advisor at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. Hi, Mr. Poloz. Pleasure to welcome you back to studio.
Great to be here.
I appreciate you making the time. Sure. I wanted to ask you, it's been a few months since we spoke, since the tariffs were in full effect. If you were to, write a story about the economic impact of the tariffs thus far, what would the headline read?
Well, it's like we talked about last time. We expected investment, there would be a freeze. There has been. You can really see that in the numbers. And there's inflation bubbling here, percolating maybe is a better term. It's showing up, which is what we discussed. Maybe a little slower than we might have expected, but that's because a lot of companies tried to swallow the first round impact, I think maybe hoping it would get negotiated away. So what we've got now is two economies actually that are sliding, let's say not in recession probably, but sliding in that direction. The trajectory is not a positive one for both the U.S. and Canada. And so as a result, we're seeing it, labor market numbers, we're seeing it in consumption. The one good bright light I would say is Canada consumption numbers, because at the time we couldn't estimate how much of effect this would be. The Canadians would switch to buying Canadian, and we'd stay home for holidays. And when you go around Canada, you can see they really did. And so as a result, retail sales have stayed pretty buoyant. And I think none of us could have estimated that, but it's one positive in there, at least from a macro standpoint. It's not a positive what's driving it, but at least that's holding up the numbers a little bit. But fundamentally, the backbone of the economy is weakening.
Since we last spoke, what did happen is kind of, I think, an acknowledgement that there won't necessarily be some sort of formalized trade agreement before we start renegotiating CUSMA, that we will be in this period of relative uncertainty until those negotiations take place. Is there anything, therefore, that can course correct the trajectory, or will things get darker, to be blunt?
Well, potentially. The government is making several moves, prominent among them, the extra spending on defense. Government procurement policies, those kinds of things can make a noticeable difference. Depends on how quickly they actually land, and I can't predict that. But usually when the labor market data start to turn sour, there's a momentum there. The first part of it is we stop hiring. It's before the layoffs actually start. We have quite a few layoffs in both Canada and the U.S., but they've stopped hiring, for several months now, and Canada we actually have negatives. And by the way, the unemployment for Canada is up 2.4% from the low, which is quite a bit. If you look at youth from 15 to 24, it's up 4 points. Actually, it's double the unemployment rate, the overall unemployment rate, 14.5%.
How worrying is that?
Well, that's quite worrying. That's the same generation of folks that were hit by the COVID how COVID affected their educational experience and so on. And here they finally get in the job market, and it's dried up pretty badly. And I'm not sure we can put that all against tariffs, Vashi. I think we may be beginning to see the first concrete evidence that AI is having a wider impact on labor markets. It's going to happen at that entry level. That's where we're going to see it first. It cuts across a lot of professions.
So that is among the issues, as you point out, that have become evident. We also last spoke about sort of what your view of the role of government in trying to catalyze investment against the backdrop of everything, right? Trying to catalyze the growth of the economy, or whatever they can do with the economy, against the backdrop of what you just laid out, both from the labor market and the tariff perspective. Based on what you've seen so far, like, is that happening to the degree it should? In what should the budget do in that regard?
Sure. Well, there's certainly, I'll call it chatter about it, both from people I talk to in the investment business, and the Prime Minister himself has used the term catalyze quite often in recent months. And so in that sense, I think the idea is there, certainly for large things, the infrastructure kinds of things. The big projects that they're talking about would require probably a mix of public and private money, and mostly private. But that's the sense in which the public money is catalytic. It may be structured in a form that it makes it, enhances the returns for the private sector players and stuff as a mitigant against risk, that kind of structure, which is what we talked about, I guess, close to a year ago, which was in the full economic statement, some ideas around that. So I'm, at the moment, I don't know what's going on for the budget, but I do think investment is the most important thing that needs to pick up. We need to catalyze more investment, both in infrastructure and basic investment. And that's where our next leg in productivity can come from. Basically, we need to embrace this fourth industrial revolution rather than taking our time about it. An early start, the benefits will come faster.
And what about what will, I imagine, has already become, but will be even more of a political debate? I won't ask you about the politics, but in particular, how much to spend, how much not to spend. Is this austerity? Is this not? If someone asked your advice on what this budget should look like in that regard, how aware should the federal government be of the amount it spends?
Yeah, so from what I can see, it looks like there's going to be a careful job of distinguishing between true investment, which then could be classified as investment, as opposed to operating spending. And investment is just like in a company, if it's going to generate a return, then that's something you can classify as an actual investment. And that could be held in effect off balance sheet, and it still gets financed the usual way. Right. However, it's backed up with, because it's growth generating, definitely going to create more revenues for the government as it generates economic growth in the economy. So just like with a company, an investment will pay for itself if you've structured everything right. So that's what I'm imagining as that partition between things. And then operationally, there's this plan to balance all of that, and that would require a degree of austerity on those kinds of routine items of government. How big does this all have to be, Vashi?
That's what I want to ask you.
Yes, well, I honestly don't know, but we think we know that the Trump tariffs, the new regime we're moving into, is probably going to reduce the size of major economies by around 2 percentage points, and then reduce economic growth maybe 0.5 point from then on. This is not trivial. But Canada has many opportunities to boost its economy by 2 or 3% in level terms, and if you're embracing more investment, that'll also boost the growth trend line. So I just think that the scale is such that we do have plenty of opportunities to actually offset what we're about to endure.
One final question for you, and it's about the United States economy, because in a couple of instances you've referenced how the impacts are starting to be felt there.
Yes.
They're still at a scale not as pronounced as they are here or in some other countries. And the argument that keeps getting the pushback from the White House is like, look, there's still lots of good things. The economy is growing, et cetera, et cetera. Do you expect there to be a very pronounced impact on the American economy vis-a-vis this tariff policy, and how soon do you expect that to be there?
Oh yes, I think we're seeing it now. We're seeing it in the labor market numbers. We see lots of uncertainty affecting people. So the housing market's doing poorly, and the labor market's doing poorly. Like here in Canada, consumption spending seems to be holding up, not too badly, but that would be the next thing. And so I think we'll see it, and we all dreamed that perhaps that would cause the administration to maybe shift the ground a little bit. But I'm less convinced of that now. And so we just sort of blame it on the Fed or blame it on something else. So I think as businesses here, we need to get ready for this new structure or new world that is facing us. And it won't be as robust or as efficient or as quickly growing as the old world. So we need to be dealing with that as the cards that are being dealt to us.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note, Mr. Poloz. Appreciate your analysis as always. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Stephen Poloz was the governor of the Bank of Canada. He, of course, presents the case for what Mark Carney's caucus has to consider as they meet in Edmonton. Our Abigail Beeman is on location for us in Edmonton, and she's got an interview with caucus chair James Maloney any moment now. Over to you, Abigail.
Vashi, I'm here in Edmonton where day 2 of caucus meetings are just wrapping up. These are the smaller breakout session, regional issues groups. Tomorrow, the full national caucus will come together. And who better to chat with us about that than caucus chair MP James Maloney. Thank you for being with us. I want to start by asking you about everything you've heard over the summer. How big of an agenda item is the economy when all of the MPs come back to share what they've heard?
Look, the answer is it's big, but the economy is always a big agenda. There's a lot going on, as all Canadians know. We're dealing with President Trump and the tariff issue, and it's an ongoing changing landscape day to day, week to week. So it's a big concern for everybody. But the biggest takeaway I would say I had from the summer is when I talked to my neighbors and constituents, literally every day throughout the summer, and they're confident in what the government's doing. And I said to somebody earlier today, my true barometer is when I take my dog for a walk, which I do a couple of times a day, and every time 3 or 4 different people stop me and say, "Hey, you guys are doing a great job. Keep up, keep it up. We're looking forward to it."
One person not confident in the government, Pierre Poilievre, we've heard a lot of criticism lately, especially around youth unemployment with those high numbers, the opposition saying that you're not helping, I guess to put it politely, youth struggling to find work. Is that an issue at the caucus table, and what do you...
I'm smiling because am I supposed to be surprised that Pierre Poilievre is criticizing the government and doesn't support something that's going on? Look, if I'm going to be blunt with you, I don't pay a lot of attention to what he says.
But what he's talking about is important.
Look, sure. I mean, he's talking about important issues, but I'm not going to hold my breath until he comes forward with some meaningful solution that's constructive.
But on youth unemployment, is that something that's being...
Yes, it's an issue. But I mean, if you talk about other issues he's raised recently, he's, in my opinion, he's very good at surface level politics. He doesn't delve into the meat, and he doesn't offer any solutions. Look, these are all challenges we all know, we all face them, and they're not unique to Canada either, I might add. But this government and Prime Minister, led by Prime Minister Carney, he's laid out the agenda quite clearly, and let's keep in mind too, he's only been the Prime Minister since May, and we're moving very, very quickly. So I'm confident things will improve.
A big question is how much are we talking about in terms of cuts when we look at all of the big investments that the Prime Minister has promised, and then also talking about an austerity budget. When I talked to you earlier today, you talked about speculation. Yeah. So what are you telling MPs to get everybody on the same page when they're worried about conveying messages of cuts to their constituents?
Well, I mean, austerity is used as it's a demonizing, scary word, and people use it in the political context to frighten people, frankly, but
didn't the Prime Minister say that in French?
But look, I mean, what we're talking about is a responsible, economically efficient approach to government. And you've got Prime Minister Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the former governor of the Bank of England. In my opinion, who better to lead the charge when you're trying to deal with those types of challenges? Look, I don't know what's going to be in the budget. I haven't. We'll have to wait and see what's in it, but I'm confident that the word austerity will be a positive thing once people see what's in the budget.
And on that message of caucus cohesion, like no surprise that by the end of the Trudeau era there was much discontent among the ranks. So what's being done to have MPs feel that they are being listened to by the centre?
Well, that's my job. I'm the caucus chair. That's why we're here at Edmonton. Look, I have always been a very vocal proponent of the importance of caucus. We have 169 people in our caucus from all parts of the country, from a variety of backgrounds, people who have so much to bring to the table on every subject. Young kids ask me all the time, what should I do if I want to be a politician? I said, do whatever you want, do something that's meaningful to you, do something that challenges to you, and do something that engages to you. Because I said, look, I had a certain career path, I did what I did, but if everybody was like me, it'd be really boring. So we have this diversity of groups and diversity of backgrounds, so there's a lot of power to draw on, and so I don't think there's any problem. I mean, look, we have 70 brand new MPs in our caucus, and that's very exciting. It's a renewal of sorts, and it is very much a new government with a new prime minister, and we're going to bring everybody together, and that's part of what we're doing here this week in Edmonton.
Thanks so much, Caucus Chair James Maloney. We will leave it there, and I'll send it back to you, Bash.
All right, thank you so much, Abigail. That's Abigail Beeman for us over in Edmonton with James Maloney, the Liberal caucus chair. They gave us a lot to unpack with our front bench. Up a little bit later on this evening, Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Before that, however, I do want to turn to a developing story out of the Middle East. Israel has conducted what it calls a, quote, precision strike against senior Hamas political officials. The target, a building in the capital of Qatar. Hamas claims that its top leaders survived the attack, but that 5 lower-level members were killed. Qatar, a key regional ally of the United States, is condemning the strike. So too is Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The White House says U.S. President Donald Trump, quote, feels very badly about the location of the attack.
Unilaterally bombing inside Qatar, a sovereign nation and close ally of the United States that is working very hard and bravely taking risks with us to broker peace, does not advance Israel or America's goals. However, eliminating Hamas, who have profited off the misery of those living in Gaza, is a worthy goal.
Here in Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney is condemning the attack, describing it as, quote, an intolerable expansion of violence and an affront to Qatar's sovereignty. Carney goes on to say such attacks pose a grave risk of escalating conflict throughout the region and that they imperil the hostage and ceasefire negotiations hosted by the Emir of Qatar. We are going to take a quick break on Power Play. Up next, however, there's some breaking news out of the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court has decided to hear arguments in the case against Donald Trump's tariffs this November. We are going to talk to the lead for that case against Donald Trump's tariffs. Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield is my guest live on the other end of a short break. Welcome back to Power Play. We've got some breaking news this hour from the United States. The Supreme Court now says it will hear the case against Donald Trump's tariffs in November. Much of the president's trade war has been deemed illegal by lower courts after a challenge brought by a coalition of Democratic U.S. state attorneys general, led by the Attorney General of Oregon, Dan Rayfield, who joins us live right now. Hi, Mr. Rayfield. Pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thank you for making the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
I wanted to start off just with your reaction now that we're in receipt of a timeline for how soon the Supreme Court will hear arguments in this case, November. Does the expediency with which that's happening surprise you at all, or is that what you hope for?
No, how fast this moves is going to be dependent on the importance of the issue. And you have, arguably one of the president's biggest initiatives that he's trying to implement by abusing an emergency power that's impacting businesses and consumers across the country. It's impacting international relationships. So it's not unusual that the Supreme Court would choose to fast track it. In fact, that is what we had asked them to do in partnership with the federal government. So it's great to hear that news today, and truly looking forward to getting back in the courtroom and arguing this.
In layman's terms, what is the crux of the legal argument you will present to the court against the imposition of these tariffs?
Yeah, and really simply, the founding document in the United States is our Constitution. And the Constitution specifically says that the power to tariff rests with Congress. So that is their power. Congress gave some of that power to the president under really specific laws. The one law that they didn't give the president that power is under his emergency powers. And so President Trump is the first president to ever use this emergency power in an attempt to implement tariffs. And he did it in a way that is contrary and at odds with all of the other statutes and laws that were passed by Congress to do tariffs. So it's pretty simple. It's an abuse of an emergency power in a way that Congress didn't intend. And therefore, all of those actions are unconstitutional. Pretty simple.
If I understand, and simple to you, but maybe not to me, who is the furthest thing from a legal scholar. If I understand the White House's argument to the contrary, it's that the president does have the authority to do it without Congress, based on something called the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. What is your response to that argument?
Exact same thing. No president since the history of the enactment of that law has ever tried to use it for tariffs. In fact, President Trump himself, during his first 4 years, implemented tariffs, but he did it under the right statutes, the statutes that every other president has used to implement tariffs. So it's pretty simple. If it was so good to use it now, why not have used it during his first 4 years? And why hasn't any other president tried to use it? And why has Congress filed briefs in the court saying, hey, we didn't grant you this power? Additionally, you have judges at multiple levels of our courts disagreeing with the president. And you have judges that were, one of them that was even appointed by the president, and a couple of others that were appointed by Republicans. So you have this diversity of legal scholars, and you have the history of how this law has been used that really kind of show that the president has overstepped his bounds.
How do you think, I guess, or in what way might that inform your view of the way in which the Supreme Court might navigate this? Because I think one of the big differences between Canada and the U.S. and the way our Supreme Courts work is the inherent political nature, to a degree, of the Supreme Court most recently in the past few years. I think we from the outside would look at this and say, hey, there's a lot of people on that Supreme Court who seem to agree with Donald Trump in instances we wouldn't have thought the Supreme Court would previously, but in some instances they haven't. And you point out some Trump-appointed judges who have, sided with you on this case. How do you anticipate that plays out?
Yeah, and it's one of those interesting situations where I think politicians want to politicize our judicial system, and they want to politicize it when they don't get a ruling they like, and they want to politicize it when they get a ruling they do like. And I think it is foundational upon all of us here in the United States to really adhere to the independence of a judiciary. It's a hallmark of any democracy. And there have been rulings that have come out of the United States Supreme Court that the president hasn't liked. Now, frankly, there's been rulings that have come out that I didn't like either. But what I do believe is that these 9 independent judges are going to take a look at this case, and they're going to see the exact same facts that all of the other justices have seen in this situation, and they're pretty compelling. And ultimately, the argument will be, hey, no president has ever used this power, and this president is abusing an emergency power that Congress never intended. And that is something that is foundational for us as Americans in this world where what we write in our laws, it doesn't matter who you are, you have to follow those laws. And so the hope is when these justices look at that, they will see what all the other justices have seen.
So this case applies to those so-called reciprocal tariffs and the ones that we have labeled here, to do with the accusations around fentanyl at the border. They don't apply to some of the more punishing sectoral tariffs that have been levied against Canadian exports going into the United States. Do you think that what happens in this case could have any impact on those other tariffs and any potential legal challenges to them moving forward?
Absolutely. And the way to think about that is these are tariffs that are being implemented under this emergency power. So if the court rules that the emergency power doesn't grant the authority for the president to implement any tariffs, that will have a ripple impact upon any tariff that the president has issued under this emergency statute. Now, there's different ways that the Supreme Court could rule that might validate, or not validate, but leave in place some of the tariffs implemented under this statute. And you may have different arguments about whether the tariffs actually deal with the problem itself or whether the problem itself is an extraordinary problem under the statute. So there will be some factual determinations that might need to be engaged in depending on how the Supreme Court rules. The way the lower court ruled, it definitely would have an impact on all of the existing tariffs that have been implemented so far. But it'll be remains to be seen, obviously, depending on what the Supreme Court says.
Okay, well, Canadians will be watching as close as ever. Mr. Rayfield, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Dan Rayfield is the Attorney General of Oregon, leading the charge there against U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs, which we have learned this afternoon or early this evening will make their way to the Supreme Court in November. We'll take a quick commercial break here on Power Play. Just ahead, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre makes a big play for the youth vote. Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. Our front bench is up next to talk about that.
After a decade of liberal taxes, liberal spending, out-of-control liberal immigration, reckless crime policies, the Canadian promise is really broken. We see an entire generation priced out of home ownership. We see rampaging crime in our streets. We see overcrowded communities as a result of immigration. Now, Mark Carney promised to be different. Instead, he's worse than Justin Trudeau.
Pierre Poilievre holding his fourth press conference in the past 7 days this morning, promoting his plan to accelerate home building. It's the latest in a series of announcements from the Conservative leader ahead of his return to Parliament next week. So what's the strategy behind the increasingly frequent public policy pitches, and how should the Liberals respond? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Next to him, that's Larissa Waller. She's the founder of Henley Strategies, also a former head of communications for Ontario's Conservative Premier Doug Ford. Here with me in studio, Kathleen Monk is former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk & Associates. And rounding us out tonight, Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Hey, happy Tuesday. Larissa, I think it's Tuesday. Yeah. Larissa, I'll start with you. I think there's I was saying to you earlier on radio, the same thing. I see a very clear delineation between pre-by-election and post. And certainly for the last 6 months, the Conservatives have been unable to drive the news cycle the way they used to, let's say, a year ago. The last week has seen a real effort to be able to do that. What do you think is the impetus behind that?
Honestly, there's no secret sauce here. It is putting out policy and having a press conference and having the federal Liberals respond. This is happening at the same time that the Liberals, their communication frankly sucks. Their theory of communication, they're putting out too much stuff in one announcement. And so the Conservatives are doing a good job of driving the narrative, talking about things that are frankly very, very timely and things that people are worried about, right? Youth unemployment is up. Kids are going back to school. They didn't work during the summer, and so they don't know how they're going to pay for school this year. And then you have the Liberals are dumping all of their big announcements, and frankly, there's some good stuff in there. They're dumping it all on one day on a Friday afternoon. It's not hard to beat them at this communications game right now.
Kathleen, what are your thoughts? You talk about comms all the time. It has been interesting the last week to see some frequency and some drive for relevance that wasn't there prior to the by-election.
Yeah, I think that Mr. Poilievre is doing a lot of the right moves. He did what he needed to do. After the loss, he went to ground. He worked really hard, actually, in the summer to earn that by-election, right? He was pretty quiet. Canadians were kind of, tired of seeing him after the election of the last 2 years of his, incredible growth that he did have. And he did the work over the summer, and now he's surfacing. And he's benefiting from a few things. He's benefiting from, not only is he on topic, on point, immigration, crime, housing, the budget, right, and jobs. But he's also like benefiting from his viral content that he puts out there. He's a veritable clip machine. I mean, I look as a former communications staffer at some of the clips that he's rolled out over the last week, you know, the skinny man, fat man clip and a few others that really just are sticky, and they stick to media, and people listen and their ears perk up, frankly. And also he's benefiting from, you know, a growing almost ecosystem of right-leaning online media that is helping him, including his own YouTube channel and platform, where he has incredible numbers in terms of audiences. So he is once again improving the strength that he has, the latent muscle that he hasn't used for the last few months, frankly, and he is flexing it and his ability to actually shape the political discourse and narrative in this town. And he is making Carney respond, which must be infuriating for the Prime Minister, who actually, you know, objectively, when you look at it, basically rescued this party over the last, 6 to 9 months, brought it from the flames that it was, and actually formed a government, a minority at that. But he isn't able to dominate with a message track the way that Pierre Poilievre has been so successful at.
And I think prior to the summer, it was interesting. They were, right? They made a number of announcements. They were the ones responding to the big moves from Donald Trump. But then things quieted over the summer. There was a lot of instability in the relationship with the U.S. that left an opening, it feels like, now at the end of the summer and the early start to the fall. Dan, I want to get your take on how the government is or isn't navigating this. I just want to first play a clip so that we give equal airtime to both the parties, to the Minister for Jobs, Patty Hajdu, because she actually had an announcement in Edmonton today. She was asked about the youth unemployment rate, which is something through various announcements Poilievre has been focused on. Let me play the answer that she provided.
I mean, many economists say that youth are the canary in the coal mine. And as we see sectors threatened, as we see employers tighten up on hiring, often it is youth, those that are the newest and entering their career, that are facing the hardest time to find that employment. Young people need on-the-job experiences. They need to gain, as many employers say, soft skills as well as the credentials that they carry after their post-secondary education. So this is something that we have to stay focused on.
So if one thing jumps out to me there, it's sort of similar to the response from the Prime Minister last week on temporary foreign workers, right? Like, there's a logical case or argument to be presented, but it sort of neglects to address the emotional factor of a lot of that stuff. What is your take on how if the Liberals are prepared to deal with what we've seen over the last week, and how much that will be a factor in the fall sitting?
Look, I think Canadians elected the government to deal with some of the big challenges the country is facing. Some of them are immediate and existential, like our trade relationship with the United States and how embedded we are and invested we are in that relationship versus global trading partners that we need to be increasingly turning to, or getting big things built, getting resources developed, getting big infrastructure projects approved and built in this country, cleaning up our fiscal situation and dealing with the budget. These are big challenges that they were elected to deal with. And I think throughout the summer, they've been focused on trying to advance some of those public policy initiatives and then deal with breaking crises, whether or not that is in the trade relationship or whether or not it's with challenges in certain federally regulated sectors with unions, like the Air Canada strike this summer. Those are big things that they have been focused on trying to move forward. I think in this moment, it's difficult for opposition parties to break through, right? That is the challenge they've faced. And I think Pierre Poilievre has tried to cut through that noise, tried to focus in on the things that he is quite strong on. I think affordability is an issue that the Conservatives are stronger on and he is stronger on, and helps him try and speak to young voters. I'm a little more skeptical than my colleagues about how effective that's going to be, given all of the noise in the system, all of the attention and energy that's paid in our news media and in the information that Canadians consume to those other bigger global challenges. His ability to cut through is, I think, a little bit suspect right now. I don't know that we're seeing it. When Parliament resumes, I think he's going to have a platform again to try and continue to do that. The question is, who is the opponent he's fighting? You listen to Mr. Poilievre talk, it's as though he's trying to fight a different opponent. He's trying to fight some radical left liberal thing he keeps talking about, a boogeyman, a Justin Trudeau. That doesn't exist for him any longer. I think a lot of young Canadians, particularly young Canadian women, who Mr. Poilievre have struggled with, look at the data. They are seeing this government try to deal with some of those big problems that the country faces, taking a more pragmatic approach, a more moderate approach. And I think that is what's working, and that's what's resonating politically right now. Pierre Poilievre seems to be wanting to have a very different fight, and I don't think that fight's materializing for him in the way that it was the last few years.
I do, Laura, agree that Mark Carney is not Justin Trudeau, and I don't think that the federal Conservative leader has necessarily figured out what he needs to augment, if anything, to address that. Like, I take Dan's point on that. But I also think at the same time, like, it wasn't necessarily like objectively I can say they're breaking through. But last week, Cabinet was told by Leger, you were there, I were there, that people are moving on from those big existential issues that Dan rightly points out have dominated the news cycle because they're becoming accustomed to it. And we interviewed the vice president of Leger who talked to the prime minister that day, and he said, like, Canadians want to know what you're doing for them. Like, they want to know what is in this for you. And I imagine that that has to be internalized at some point as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Pierre Poilievre has been adept as opposition leader in kind of setting the agenda and the tone for the issues that Canadians care about. I mean, he was kind of the first one to talk about inflation, affordability. He took on the carbon tax. He took on the EV mandate, and he's trying to take credit for that. And I think he's trying to find the next big thing. And so I think that's why you've seen him out as Parliament is set to resume, trying to talk about these issues that he wants to tackle with Mark Carney. And while the policy ideas may not be so different than what we heard from the election campaign, I think times have changed somewhat. And you mentioned, Bashi, the polling about, you know, the existential threat or the panic, the Trump panic of striking a deal has kind of passed, and people have maybe reluctantly accepted that we're in this muddy zone now with the U.S. administration where we may have to accept some sort of tariffs on sectors, and we probably aren't going to strike a deal, and no one really knows what's happening. And so there's kind of that less of that urgency than we saw potentially during the campaign, and people have moved on to pocketbook issues. But, you know, the Carney government is trying to tie all of their announcement and their measures about business to Canadians, you know, financial situations. And so I think they're trying to still make that link with what's happening with the U.S. administration, the full-scale rupture, as the Prime Minister says, to the economy, and how, you know, they need to fully change and adapt to that. And I think that will be their argument going forward. But I think, you know, you've seen from hints from the Prime Minister, he's going to make some big announcements about housing. He's going to talk about bail reform, he said. And so I think, you know, those things that, you know, those pressing issues that Poilievre is trying to set the agenda on, I think will be addressed. But, you know, clearly the leader of the opposition is out there. He's kind of regained a bit of confidence since winning the by-election, and he's trying to set the tone before Parliament resumes next week.
Okay, speaking of setting the tone, we've got to talk about the budget and a lot of the tone setting ahead of that. We'll do that after a short break with our front bench. We're back in a moment.
We will review, and we'll cut where we have to. We'll invest where we'll have to. And, you know, I hear often, oh, you know, you're going to cut services. You're going to cut back the public service. We don't know that for sure. Let's not prejudge the review.
I think the mistake the media is making is they're judging him by his words rather than by his deeds. Oh, yeah, he's made lots of promises. But Mark Carney has broken every single major promise that he has made.
The Prime Minister is set to deliver a budget next month, and he gave a preview of sorts last week, saying in French that it would be a budget of both austerity and investment. In his own election platform, however, the Prime Minister committed to maintaining some big government spending line items, including protecting key Trudeau-era programs like childcare, dental care, pharmacare, and school food programs, protecting transfers to people and governments, and capping the public service, not cutting it. The front bench is back to talk about how that might all unfold. We've got Laura Stone, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Dan Moulton here. Kathleen, I'll start with you. This is going to be a really interesting policy exercise, but also communications exercise, because it is interesting that, like, that word austerity was used in French, And since then, it's just been us basically asking whomever the government can put up, like, what exactly is that going to mean?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the line was so clear from the election platform, caps, not cuts. But in fact, the cuts that Carney has laid out, or his finance minister has laid out of 7.5, 10 to 15, is far greater than we even ever saw from the Stephen Harper government, who asked to cut 5 to 10% over 3 years.
And did so incrementally.
Incrementally, exactly. Yeah. And let's just remember what those cuts under the Harper years did. That meant a $36 billion cut to healthcare. That meant that veterans who returned from Afghanistan didn't get the supports they need. That means certain veteran offices closed. There were cuts to CFIA. The list goes on and on. That's when we brought in the famous Phoenix systems for cost savings, right? That turned into be an absolute blunder and has cost the government and taxpayers so much money. So we're now asking public servants to cut much deeper, much greater, but within the same timeline of 3 years. And I think it's actually going to be really, really, really stark if Carney does pivot away from what he promised the campaign, which was, frankly, just a cap, not a cut. I think that anyone can acknowledge that, sure, everyone can do a little belt tightening, including myself. But it's like, but I think that, but the deepness that he's doing and so quickly he's doing is really going to drive off that left flank that went and he attracted all those new Democrat and left-leaning voters. Well, maybe they go back to, inshallah,
here's Kathleen's like dream sequence. They're going to come back to the, okay.
That's right.
Right. Dan, I'll throw that. I love how you just stopped talking at that point. Yeah. Dan, I'll throw that over to you. I guess, I think the Prime Minister made no secret of the fact that he would be looking at the finances in a different way than his predecessor. I think it was one of the main ways he tried to differentiate himself during the campaign, and did so pretty pointedly at times, like criticizing the economic record of the Trudeau government. How do you anticipate, though, they will lay the groundwork for? It won't just, I'm teasing Kathleen, but there are a lot of unions at the ready right now, even after that interview with Wayne Long, like the union that represents the people who work for the CRA, et cetera, et cetera. There will be opposition to at least what they've said sounds like might be possible, if in fact that's what materializes. What kind of groundwork do you think they're going to be laying?
Well, I think the groundwork is being laid, right? I think the leaks over the course of the summer have been trying to set a certain expectation of what spending reductions might look like. And it remains to be seen whether or not that magnitude will actually be delivered in what we see from the finance minister this fall, or even in future documents from the federal government in the spring of next year. So let's wait to see the extent to which they actually bring forward reductions on that scale. I do think Canadians elected the government to clean up some of the finances in Ottawa and deal with some of the spending. They've been clear about the need to address that. What I'm watching for most closely in this budget and in future budgets from this government is the extent to which they follow on some of the Liberal platform commitments around restructuring how public finances are handled in this country, right? The Prime Minister has talked before he was Prime Minister and since he was elected about moving to a spending approach that differentiates between capital and program spending at the federal level, and changing how budgets are structured and how they have been in the past. That would, I think, facilitate the kind of approach he's talking about when he looks at being able to reduce program spending but continue to make the right kind of investments that are necessary to stimulate the Canadian economy and ensure that Canadians are well off, right? That approach is very different than how finances are typically handled and would mean, I think, pretty seismic change. So I'll be watching very closely to the extent to which we see that profiled in the budget in a few weeks' time.
I'm also watching closely because I've pitched my husband that my spending on purses will now be an investment because they accrue extra value over time.
That's true,
Fingers
though.
crossed it works as well. It is. Thank you, Larissa. I appreciate the support. What are your thoughts on this? Not the purses, the actual political dynamic.
No, there are many purses. Everybody can Google that increase in value, and that is crazy. So I want to actually speak to something Kathleen said about comparing the cuts that Carney's proposing versus the Harper era cuts. The difference is there's so much more to cut. The broader public service increased 40% since 2015. At the CRA, we have 60,000 employees versus the IRS that has 80,000 employees, and they have 9 times our population. I don't think we have 9 times the service level. I don't think we have 40% better service from our public service than we did in 2015. So there appears to be a lot of fat to trim. What I want to also bring up is to Dan's point that this Prime Minister is going to be so much different in how he approaches finances. You know, we had to peer pressure him into doing a fall budget. He wasn't going to do one. And somebody who doesn't understand the importance of transparency and telling the electorate what you're going to do, how much you're going to spend, where you're going to make the investments, I have very little confidence that he's going to actually read the room here. He wants to talk about big projects and big programs and, you know, the national interest stuff, and it's all been great on paper. We haven't seen anything happen in real life. And I think if you look at the youth, for example, that Pierre Poilievre is speaking to, they don't want another program. They just want the opportunity to get a job and buy a house and live their Canadian dream. I think that Mark Carney doesn't understand that. And so I'm really interested to see what's in this budget, and I'm really interested to see how he's going to communicate it to people who are feeling real hurt right now and who feel left behind by sort of the thinking process of this Liberal government.
I've got like 1 minute on the dot, Laura. It's all yours.
I think Mr. Carney's probably kicking himself that he agreed with the language of the French reporter in the Scrum last week who used the words austerity and that he repeated. I'm sure he would not have personally chosen that terminology because it does have very negative connotations. I think he, in the minds of the public, I think at this moment, he still does have a lot of legitimacy in the economic and financial space because of his background and his experience. I think there's a lot riding on the budget and expectations will be very high as to exactly how the government's going to fulfill its lofty mandate. I find it interesting that the Conservatives' argument is that they actually don't think he's going to pursue austerity enough. They don't actually believe that he's going to make these cuts. So I think that actually might, put the government in a bit of a fortunate position because they may be feeling squeezed from both sides, and that's where they like to be. They like to ride the middle. So we really won't know what this kind of unclear mumbo jumbo of austerity and investment really means until that budget is tabled. But I think they may be able to pull it off just because they'll be feeling squeezed from both sides of the political spectrum.
We shall see. My cheesy last line always. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Our front bench, Dan Moulton, Larissa Waller, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone. We're back in a moment with our takeaway. Our takeaway this evening comes from former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz, our guest earlier on the show. The GDP of this country is contracting. It did in the second quarter. Unemployment is up. Here's where he says that leads us.
So what we've got now is 2 economies, actually, that are sliding, let's say, not in recession probably, but sliding in that direction. The trajectory is not a positive one for both the U.S. and Canada.
You heard it there. Mr. Poloz indicated that it's likely that the U.S. and Canada are both sliding into a recession. Lots of reaction, I'm sure, from Edmonton, where Liberal caucus continues to meet. We'll have coverage throughout the evening and into tomorrow. I will leave Power Play there. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful evening.